You're listening to the Turn Autism Around podcast, episode number 91. And today I have a returning guest, Gary Mayerson, who is an attorney with Mayerson and Associates in New York City. And the reason I wanted to have Gary back on the show, he is on episode number 43 back last year in 2019, but I wanted to have Gary on again because he wrote this great new book called Autism's Declaration of Independence. And it's a very comprehensive book, and it was supposed to come out. It's supposed to be printed right before COVID struck. And so it was halted and lots of COVID information. So we're going to talk about the COVID implications of IEPs and all kinds of services, whether virtual instruction, counts during IDEA and FAPE and all kinds of things. We're also going to talk about some general issues in terms of transitioning to adulthood, bullying, and all kinds of things. So it's a fascinating interview with Gary Mayerson. So let's get to that now. Okay, so Gary, you are one of my few guests that I've actually had on twice. So welcome back to the podcast.
Thank you. I'm honored to be back.
Awesome. So the reason I wanted to have you back was last time you were on episode number 43. So marybarbera.com/43. And last time we talked about you were in the process of writing a book, and it's now out. It's called Autism's Declaration of Independence, Navigating Autism in the Age of Uncertainty. And interesting time to write such a book, right? With the whole COVID pandemic going on. So can you tell us about your book and how you started writing it, and then what happened when COVID came down the line?
Sure. I mean, the book was largely going to be my attempt to put us forward and go towards the position of independence, greater levels of independence and self-sufficiency. And we'd obviously learned a lot over the last 20 or 30 years of educating students with autism and what methods worked and what didn't work. And I originally was going to be moving the book towards more of an outcome approach, that we should be looking at the outcomes, whether it's transition to adulthood, whatever it is. When the child exits the educational system at age 21, they should be able to graduate to something. So the outcome was very important, and I wanted to write a book that would talk more about the outcome and how to get to that the outcome that everybody wants for their child. Obviously, within just literally a week or two of the publication date, or when it was going to go to press, COVID-19 came to our shores with a real vengeance, and it was obvious that we had to say something about COVID-19, and there really wasn't that much to say at that time because we really didn't know what the impact would be. Everything was exploding all over the country, and so it was the uncertainty that is part of the title was the uncertainty that I was writing about. But many of the things which I was writing about back in April and May, which have now are in the book, many of them have come to fruition. It is coming out almost exactly the way I sort of predicted it would happen. So
yeah,
it's still unfolding today, obviously.
Yeah. And I didn't have a chance to read the whole book yet. I looked at the very comprehensive table of contents, and I started reading the book, and kind of right away, I was alarmed to find out that back when the CARES Act was being negotiated and passed, it's a $2.2 trillion CARES Act. Somehow it started to get involved that the IDEA, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, was suddenly at risk of really falling apart and being waived. And can you tell us about like how you found out about that? And it's kind of scary when these big packages, whatever it is, are passed, because people put a lot of stuff in them that could really impact our lives.
Well, this is a gigantic bullet that the disability community dodged. And the story is really it's actually quite shameful, because when this disaster of a pandemic struck, there were some in Congress that thought we have to come up with these loan packages, and we're giving trillions of dollars away, and we're going to be paying people $600 a week for unemployment, and all the money that was being pumped in. Somebody, particularly Senator Lamar Alexander from Tennessee, decided that it would be a great idea if we could get rid of some of the aspects of the IDEA statute and somehow balance the budget of our country on the backs of the children that the IDEA statute was meant to serve and protect. So initially, Senator Alexander proposed a small legislative provision in the CARES Act that would have given Betsy DeVos, the Secretary of Education, full authority to designate what sections of IDEA she thought should be waived, and that originally the way it was written is if that happened, DeVos would have been able to knock out gigantic sections of the IDEA statute and leave people without any of these protections. Well, there was a lot of anger and discussion about that, and so the way that the statute was ultimately modified, the proposal was that Secretary DeVos would have 30 days to identify for Congress those provisions of IDEA that she thought should be waived. That was a little bit better, but it still left open a gigantic threat that she would do that. And then as soon as she would identify these provisions, it was just a matter of time before Congress would pass those provisions, and that we would be missing gigantic sections of the IDEA statute. There was a tremendous outcry. Well, the 30 days came and went, and surprisingly, Secretary DeVos did not make any major changes, or didn't recommend any major changes to the IDEA statute, leaving the protections largely intact. So, most people don't really know the backstory of that, but that was a really close call for our community, and I think that it almost was a complete disaster. But I don't know what exactly happened. I know that disability groups, including our firm, got very active in opposing what was going on, but Secretary DeVos decided not to take this on, and we still have today all the protections. And parents should know that, the virus did not wipe out the IDEA protections. The IDEA statute's protections are there; they're in full force and effect, and parents should not hesitate to invoke their protections when they need to.
Yeah. So, as we're recording this, kids are beginning to go back to school, and we're kind of a little bit ahead of schedule, so this probably won't come out until September. But so virtual instruction versus in-person instruction, and how is that a free, appropriate public education, especially when these kids are very severely impacted by autism, and they need their parent to basically sit with them to do instruction of any kind?
Yeah, we hear a lot of conflicting stories about virtual instruction, remote instruction, telehealth instruction. It's all the same. So many of the children that we serve have reported varying degrees of success with this technology. So much depends on all the different factors. How good of a surrogate teacher the parent may be in getting their child to attend. It's all about attending. I mean, it's not about attendance, it's about attending, okay? Especially when you're dealing with the autism population. And many children with autism, as you know, have great difficulty with distractibility and attentional issues to begin with. So, and that's even when there is a one-on-one instructional support right there at their side. So we've heard some conflicting stories. Some parents report that their children have actually done okay with the remote instruction. I would say the majority have reported problems, that there have been problems. And Amy Davies Lackey, Dr. Lackey of the Manhattan Children's Center, wrote a chapter in my book about the whole issue about remote instruction and how difficult it is to measure success. How do you go about measuring progress with this? Because it's one thing to say, well, the child had 4 hours of remote instruction. Well, did they learn anything? Did they pick up anything? So how do you translate? How do you take the IEP and then take this virtual model of instruction and then move it into a remote setting like remote instruction, and then have it be effective. That's the trick, and it is very, very difficult. It's very difficult to effect that. It really is. So how do you track success? What about generalization? You might be able to use it to probe for generalization, but it is not an ideal system, to be sure. And most parents that we talk to are looking for more of an in-person instruction model if their child is diagnosed with autism, certainly.
Yeah. And do you find some school districts are providing in person, even if they're not providing in person full 5 days to typically developing kids? Are they providing that for kids with special needs, or are they providing, okay, we'll send a personal care assistant into your home to provide the instruction via remote? And like it's like I think about half and half of our listeners are half parents, half professionals, mostly from the United States, but we have listeners from around the world. And, some of the kids, some of the people listening don't have the protections of IDEA and free appropriate public education, which is an acronym FAPE. But most of the listeners probably do have those protections. But you can't get stuff if there's no stuff to be had. Like, I don't want to, turn this into an episode where you're like having parents revolt against school districts for not providing FAPE when really nobody knows what to do.
Well, in New York City, where our office is located, for example, the administration, I'm talking about the mayor's office and the Department of Education, they're convinced that schools are going to be opening in 2 weeks, 3 weeks, and that the teachers are going to be there. But the UFT, the United Federation of Teachers, is saying, we don't think it's safe enough to come back. We're telling our membership not to come. And if the teachers don't show up, then you're basically relegated to virtual instruction again anyhow. So much depends on something, a little minor detail, like, are the teachers going to show up?
A little minor detail.
And listen, I can certainly understand from the teacher's perspective. Many of them have small children. God forbid there should be an outbreak of the virus comes back with a resurgence. The children that go to school or they may be bringing the virus into their homes and infecting other people. So it is a major issue, and I think that we'll know in 2 or 3 weeks if the teachers are going to actually show up. That's New York City. But in the suburbs, it's a mixed bag. Many school districts are offering some kind of hybrid environment where there's going to be a couple of days of remote instruction, a couple of days and reduced hours and reduced number of children allowed in the classroom at any one time for in-person instruction. So it runs the gamut. I think that every school district has its own method of how it's going to be approaching the problem, and it depends again. It largely depends upon like the rates of viral transmission and what's going on in your community. If you're in Florida or California right now, you might have a whole different approach than what's going on in New York or perhaps in other states that have the virus relatively under control.
Yeah. So IEP meetings, due process hearings, like, are they still going on, or?
Sure. That's the big surprise, that by virtue of using the phone, I mean, just a lowly phone, we're able to conduct IEP meetings. We're able to have hearings. I've had a number of hearings since March that I've done from my home, by phone, and just it is somewhat of a challenge to be able to determine witness credibility and witness demeanor. But other than that, the documents, the exhibits get circulated and disclosed days before the hearing. There's a 5-day disclosure rule, and by the time of the hearing, everybody knows what the evidence is, and then you just have the people testify, and you wait for the decision. So yes, IEP meetings are actually, I think, easier to schedule now because they're not waiting for, the speech teacher can't make it or this person can't make it. There's no excuse because everyone can pretty much dial in now. So that's the good news. The technology is very helpful for IEP meetings and due process hearings.
So the legal situation is that if an IEP meeting is due, they're being held, and they should be being held. And what about IEPs in general? Like, now that say you're doing virtual instruction, do the IEP goals change so that they work on more daily living skills, or do you work on more communication with the siblings who are also at home, or do you just leave the IEP and pretend like everything's normal?
Well, we can't pretend that everything's normal, because it's not. Everything has changed. Everything.
Yeah.
So for example, you mentioned ADL skills. Before we would be teaching ADL skills, activities of daily living, such as getting dressed and undressed, hygiene, brushing of teeth, cooking, not cooking, just toileting skills and things like that. Okay, so now we have a whole new group of ADL skills that we must teach, because it's potentially life-threatening. How much distance to stand between them and another person, whether or not to shake hands with somebody, which of course we don't.
Mask wearing, like desensitization to mask wearing.
Exactly. How not only to put it on, but to put it on and keep it on for hours at a time. That requires a lot of patience and skill. But this is it is a gigantic safety issue that it's in the IP. Least restrictive environment is obviously a big consideration. But are we really talking about plunking a kid in a classroom where there's 25 other students that are really close by? Probably not. With the distancing, maybe that student will now have to be in a 6, 7, or 8 student classroom, and that'll have to do for a least restrictive environment, because the least restrictive environment has to somehow interface with the safety issue, so that it's all reasonable. Other accommodations, proximate seating, you name the accommodation, it'll be affected. It largely could be affected. So we're looking at IEPs with a new lens now. With the virus. I think that when the virus is gone, we'll be back to what was our prior normal. But right now, we have to, every single line item has to be revisited and revalued in accordance with what's going on the ground with the virus and the safety issues that are attendant to that. Sure.
Wow.
It's a whole new world.
So you do also talk in your book about residential placements and its effect on with COVID. I just interviewed for episode number 86, Lisa C., who spent a year or more awaiting residential placement for her son, who's 19 or 20, and he finally did get placed a couple weeks ago. But did COVID affect that too? I know the waits have been extremely long anyway. So what's the deal with COVID and residential treatments?
Well, I can just tell you from our experience that what we've seen is an uptick in the demand. There was already a strong demand for residential placements to begin with, but we've seen an uptick that as parents are home with their students for months at a time, that the need for residential becomes even more critical and apparent. So those parents who were kind of maybe on the fence a year ago, gee, is it too early to go residential, or maybe we should wait another year? Many of those parents are pushing now to get in the door. So I think the demand has I've seen an uptick in the demand. And what we're also seeing is with our existing clients that are in these residential facilities, that often, because of the need to protect the entire school, the facility, that there are very almost draconian safety measures that are being implemented, so that if you drop off your child, you may not be able to get back in to visit for months at a time, because they have to protect everyone. And so that they're going to go a little bit overboard and probably in a good way to make sure that everyone stays safe. So I've heard, some parents have called and said, we dropped off our son in X month. It's been 5 months. They still won't let us in. But the answer has always been, well, we're trying to protect everyone. So that there are there are different limitations now in terms of access and egress into these facilities that parents did not have to face, pre-COVID.
Yeah.
But the biggest change is simply the demand. There's just greater demand than ever for residential placements for students who do need that.
And I see, online a lot of parents who are really struggling with, they used school as a 6 hour, break from their child who has high needs constant supervision. The aggression that a child might have had increases with, the lack of a schedule and just all kinds of things. I really am seeing a lot of struggle with families, and there's just not much answers.
Yeah, Vincent Strully, who is the executive director of the New England Center for Children up in Southborough, Massachusetts, actually wrote a section of my book about when it's time. What are some of the key factors to look for when you're considering residential placement? When is it time to be looking to residential? So, I think that Vinny really wrote a very nice point by point list of considerations that parents can turn to if they're thinking, am I in that boat? Am I going residential? Should I be considering residential? It's a very difficult decision for anyone, and it's a serious decision that should not be taken lightly. But when you need it like now.
And then the waiting lists are atrocious, which is what Lisa said on podcast episode 86, is even though it was clear that her son needed it, he ended up, really, because he had a medical history that people weren't comfortable with. And it just, like you said, once you finally make a decision, like, yeah, that's what's right for our family, it's like, well, get in line and wait. And in those times when you're waiting, especially if your older child is aggressive, that is, really challenging.
Yeah, especially if you're a single parent and you wake up in the middle of the night and your child is hovering above you with their hands out around your neck. And we've seen situations like that. You can't wait until to get your child into a quality residential facility, and yet you're right. You may have to wait months, if not longer, to have that shot.
Yeah, it's really a challenge. So, so you've said so far that one of the good things about the situation now is easier to schedule IEP meetings, easier to, due process cases are going on. But besides that, are there any other things that are kind of swinging into a better situation?
There's one thing I could think of that would fit that criteria, which is the whole telehealth, using the technology of telehealth, whether it's Zoom or some other similar technology, for other purposes. Well, I just think it's easier to sample potential transition internships virtually. Or what if a student is offered a school that there's no way to visit the school in person, but you might be able to take a virtual tour using Zoom technology or speak with the principal or the teachers to be able to consider whether that's an appropriate placement for your child. Grouped dyads and triads for speech and language development. That is a perfect technology. So, the list goes on and on, but basically, I think that the remote instruction that is failing many of our students is not something to be thrown out, that we can use this technology to our advantage for so many other aspects where it's not a problem, where in fact it's a plus. So I'm hoping and I'm thinking that you're gonna see much more telehealth technology being used for these different functions, because that they're efficient and they work and they're inexpensive and they help the process along.
Yeah.
Or even things like probing for generalization. You might be there's no end to the additional uses that telehealth can put to bear here.
Yeah, and I think I've been in the online space for over 5 years, creating my first course in 2015. And during COVID, especially, we are seeing, especially with the toddlers preschooler program, and even for the verbal behavior bundle with parents and professionals, but they're coming for online learning because the conferences got canceled or moved all to telehealth at the last minute. We have people from all over the world in different time zones accessing the training when it's appropriate for their own lives. And we've had a couple of really amazing success stories, including podcast number 78 with Michelle C., who got her daughter diagnosed at 24 months right before COVID. Then the COVID shutdown happened. So no one, starting out, she was not able to get therapists. It's a 2-month training program. And within 2 months, she reported her daughter went from 2 words in an hour to 500 words and phrases in an hour. All with her implementing. And that's all detailed in episode number 78, which we can link in the show notes. But I know I posted in both my Facebook communities, the ones that are attached to the courses, like, what are your struggles since COVID? And within days, like 3 of the 9 comments in this one group said, I consider COVID a blessing because I'm finally learning what I should do to help my child. Like before COVID, I was sending them for an hour of OT and an hour of speech, and he wasn't making much progress. But now he's home. He's with me. I'm learning, I'm doing, and I'm seeing the progress. And so, I'm used to working from home. This is what I do all day long. I spread the word through online courses and podcasts and video blogs and writing a second book like you, right on your tail, right in my second book. And, to really empower parents, I do think that that's a really good point, is that one of the good things is that this pandemic, and hopefully it's our last, and hopefully it goes away as soon as possible, has shown us the power of learning online, whether that's learning in grade school, high school, college, learning through autism courses, learning through advocacy courses, whatever. If there's a will, there's a way. And I think we should embrace the technology to say, how can we use this? And those kinds of things aren't going to change when we do get to go back to more in-person services.
No. And thank God that this technology was available when this struck. Imagine 20 years ago, if the pandemic, the last big one was back in 1918. Imagine having a pandemic like this coming in 1985 or 1990. We would have been really dead in the water educationally, because we wouldn't have any method to do this remote instruction. We would have been caught dead.
Yeah. And I've been using Zoom for, 4 years, 3 years, whenever it started. And so I know Zoom went completely crazy with new subscribers and stuff. But yeah, you're right. Thank God they were ready. And thank God for Facebook and for everything, Google Meets and Google Docs and all the technology that some people are just learning about for the first time. But so I think those are good things to address. So let's talk about non-COVID issues in your book, including bullying and there's a few before, because you said you had almost a 200-page book just pre-COVID, and then you added some stuff with COVID.
Right.
But your book addresses bullying and sexual assault. And how big of a problem is that for students with disabilities?
Well, I think obviously bullying is much more a problem and frequent than sexual assault. Sexual assault happens, and it unfortunately happens more often than we would like to think that it happens. But the bullying is a rampant issue even today, and it's gotten better. But a child with a disability, particularly autism, is likely to, by a factor of 4 to 1, to have more opportunities to be bullied than a student that's typically developing. So that statistic itself puts puts our population very much at risk. And so we had a case back in maybe about 6-7 years ago in the Second Circuit that established that bullying is a FAPE deprivation. And before that, there actually had not been a case that said that bullying was a FAPE deprivation, and that, free and appropriate public education. And that was important because bullying was being treated as some kind of inevitable rite of passage. So we had a case, and I'll be very short, in New York City where the city was denying that there was any bullying going on. The parents alleged that it had been going on for 2 years. The case went all the way up and down the line to the Second Circuit Court of Appeals, and the Court of Appeals and Judge Jack Weinstein, who's famous Judge Weinstein, who wrote the briefs for Brown versus Board of Education, was the judge who decided this case and said, of course there's been bullying. There's been bullying for 2 years. The child was deprived of a FAPE. And one of the things he said in there, which connects up with the COVID issue, is he said, children have a right to be safe at school. Children have a right to be educated in safety. So that ties right into the duty of the school district to take reasonable precautions to protect the safety of the students who attend and their families when the kids come home. So bullying is a problem. I think it is less today. We have statutes. Most states now have anti-bullying statutes. Pennsylvania has one. New Jersey has. Most states have them, and there's more sensitivity to anti-bullying efforts. One of my friends, Michael Dreiblatt, wrote a chapter in the book about bullying and what parents can do to spot when bullying is occurring, and what to do when you feel that there's bullying going on in the school, and what parents can do step by step to address it and take care of that problem. Sexual assault is a whole other issue, and we don't like to think that this ever happens, but it does happen, not frequently, but it does happen. And there's a chapter in the book about a case that we had in New Haven, Connecticut, where a student with major communication challenges was being sexually assaulted by their aide, their one-to-one aide in school. And the school district denied that there was any sexual abuse going on. We actually had to have a jury trial in federal court.
Wow.
In New Haven, Connecticut for over a week. And the jury came back with the verdict that yes, unfortunately, in fact, there was sexual abuse of this particular student. So,
and what are the, I know there's stats out there that show that people with autism, adults with autism, are X amount more likely to be sexually assaulted or abused. Do you know any of those stats?
Again, it's a multiple. There's about a 3 or 4 times more likely to happen to somebody with a developmental disability, including autism. Why? Because people with developmental disabilities make great victims, unfortunately. They either don't complain, they may not have the capacity to complain, they may not have expressive language, and even when they do complain, they're often not believed. So that people who are the perpetrators select people with disabilities precisely because they are the perfect victims.
Yeah.
So you never want to have your child in a position where they're alone with another adult in a room where there's no accountability. You want there to be transparency. You want your child to be in the presence of other adults. Then nothing is going to happen. These things, they have to normally happen in private, and that might mean like an empty classroom or a room in the basement. But it's a crime of opportunity, and it just takes a minute or two to happen. Yeah. And that's what happened in our case. It was literally just, a few minutes, boom, it happened.
And as a behavior analyst and a registered nurse, I have learned that the best way to kind of prevent sexual abuse is not only to have multiple people around, but also to teach the child how to be independent with toileting, showering, dressing, so that there's not the opportunity for, it doesn't become normal for people to be assisting and touching during dressing and that sort of thing. And I think as you get older, people move into group homes and that sort of thing. There's not an abundance of people around, and then the risk could be higher. But I think the best way, especially for kids with limited cognitive ability, to explain when to report or what is appropriate, what is not appropriate, to get them as independent as possible with these self-care tasks, I think is a job, because most of our listeners are parents or professionals who are going to, well, how can we prevent it? Not to just be like, oh my God, 3 to 4 times more likely to be sexually assaulted. It's like, we can't get paralyzed with fear. We just have to be like, okay, how can we prevent it as much as possible?
Exactly. I think you're 100% correct. In the particular story that's in the book, the student actually comes to his parents one morning at breakfast to report that there were enough facts that the parents could figure out that there was an abuse situation going on. And it apparently had not been going on for very long. So it was caught at a very early stage because the student had sufficient communication skills and had known and had been taught about good touch, bad touch. And so that was important for the child to be sensitized enough to be able to know something's not right.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So in your book, you talk about confrontations with the police, and is that something parents should be concerned about, especially in light of the Black Lives Matter movement and the police brutality cases and all that stuff? But I also know as a behavior analyst that kids with autism are much more at risk too to be misunderstood police officers and the justice system.
Yeah, I mean, we profiled 2 cases that we were involved with, and it is a growing problem because people in the autism community with inclusion and so forth are out in the community doing community things, like everyone else, and to that extent, they're sort of at greater risk, and I'll tell you why. When a police officer sees something that he or she believes is unusual, they will often be barking out all kinds of commands to the person who is the potential suspect. Let's see some ID. What's your name? Where do you live? What are you doing here? Come over here. Stand over here. And if you don't comply immediately, or if you don't give a response immediately, the police officer might believe that the person is being disrespectful to the process, and then that's how the confrontation gets started. In one of the cases that we do profile, there was a student named Reginald Latson in Virginia. We were involved with this case, and he liked to go to the library. His thing was going to the library and reading books. Imagine what a crime! An African-American young man. So somebody on the street saw this African-American young man waiting to get into the library because it wasn't time for the library to open, and reported that they saw a Black man with a gun standing outside the library. There was no gun. So the police officer got a legitimate report from somebody that said there was a man with a gun outside the library, and he thinks that there's a real threat to the library. So he shows up at the library and he says, "What's your name?" And giving all these commands: stand over here, come over here, do you have ID? Give me ID. And Reginald Latson did not comply fast enough. He didn't respond. He was a little frozen, and he just couldn't move. And so the police officer thought that he was being disrespected. He took Reginald and he threw him around and placed him on the hood of the police cruiser. And that's when the struggle began. And Reginald and the police officer tussled, and somehow, falling to the ground, the police officer unfortunately hit his head on the pavement. And with such force that he became ultimately partially paralyzed for life.
Oh, wow.
So when the rest of the police showed up, Reginald was arrested for resisting arrest and everything else.
And
because the police officer had been seriously injured, was facing major jail time. We're talking 10 years. And Reginald had Asperger's. He was sentenced to 2 years. I got involved with Bob Wright and Suzanne Wright of Autism Speaks, We petitioned the governor of Virginia, Terry McAuliffe, to commute his sentence from 2 years to a therapeutic facility in Florida, which he did, thank God, because this guy would never have survived prison for all those years. He would have died in prison. There's no question. He would not have survived. We have another situation in the book where one of our client families is profiled, who lives in Alaska, and he was getting the mail in front of his own house. He was doing something else that was a little unusual. He liked to go into people's cars on the street to make sure that he was a quirky guy, that the seatbelts were positioned properly, the rear view mirror was positioned properly. So he basically would go into people's cars and set them up for them. Somebody saw him going into a car and reported it to the police, who was a visitor in the area. Same kind of thing. The police show up. There was a confrontation. Next thing you know, Nick is on the ground being sprayed in the face with pepper spray, saying, "I want to go." And you can hear him on the video, on the body cam video, saying, "I want to go home. I want to go home. I want to go home," over and over again.
Yeah.
So it is a problem, and the police need more training to be able to identify people that are on the street that are likely to have some kind of challenge or special need that has to be accommodated, and not immediately go to 10 when you don't get answers and so forth.
Yeah. And I know we, the Autism Society in Berks County, years ago, we bought hundreds of copies of Bill Davis's book on training first responders about autism. It was a very good book. And Dennis, I can't remember his last name. Who is it?
Dennis DeBout or Dennis DeBout.
Yeah, that's the name. Dennis DeBout has a book on training first responders. So that's a practical tip that you can do, is even if you don't want to make it like buying 100 books and, a big campaign. One of the things that I recommend you do, whether you have a young child or an older child or adult with autism in your community, is make sure your neighbors know what the issues are. Make sure your neighbors are watching for wandering or this car behavior and that sort of thing. And also make sure that the local police, register them with the local police. There's a app called something Smart 911, I think, that you can kind of list Lucas's name, his birth date, his level of impairment. I mean, that's not going to help in every situation, but I think the more you can communicate your child or adult's deficits to your local police and that sort of thing, it can only help. And then also to train the police and train other first responders. And then if you have, a lower language child or adult, they're going to probably be with a care provider, but, the care provider could, the child could get aggressive if it's an older, if it's an adult and they get aggressive with the care provider, 911 can be called, and, autism, it doesn't look necessarily like there's anything wrong. So you have that. You have, he looks like he's okay. He's not having any features that would alert somebody from the start, like, oh, there's something wrong. So those are just some tips from a behavior analyst and a mom point of view that, it's scary. And I don't want this whole episode to be like, oh my God, I never thought of that. Oh my goodness, I have to worry about this. But, it is important that we kind of open our eyes to some of these legal issues that.
We're talking about reducing the threat of this happening. We're alerting parents not to aggravate them or to give them further anxiety, but rather to sensitize them to issues that they could eliminate a lot of this threat. And if you live in a small town, for example, you may want to bring your child literally to the police station to introduce them around so they feel more comfortable when they see the person dressed like that on the street, these first responders, that they'll be okay with it And the first responders in a small town will pass the word around that there's this student and child that has special needs. And I think that, it just reduces the overall threat. It's harder to do that, obviously, in an urban environment where you're never going to be able to introduce your child to all the different police personnel. It can't happen. But yeah, all these are good tips to reduce that threat. Sure.
Yeah. So, do you think with budget cuts and funding issues, some related to COVID, some related to just life in the big city, how do you think that's going to affect, programming and transition supports? And I think you say in your book that 50,000 individuals transition to adulthood every year. That the tsunami has come, and it's just, I know in Lucas's situation, his day, the place he went during the day, the pre-vocational program or sheltered workshop or whatever you want to call it. I mean, they closed down during COVID, and now we're reevaluating that placement. And so like there's just a lot of things happening, but I'm sure funding is also another aspect of that.
Well, there's funding and then there's investment. Okay. So you mentioned the 50,000 number. That's 50,000 Americans with autism will transition to adulthood every single year, leaving the IDEA protections, leaving the school district, the school age entitlements, and moving into eligibility situations. So that population has about an 85% unemployment rate, 85%. And the general population, well, it depends on what week we look at it, but it's somewhere between 5% and let's say 20%, maybe a little more than that. I mean, there are a lot of people that are unemployed, but if people are freaked out that neurotypical people are unemployed at that rate, imagine how we should be feeling that 85% of our population is unemployed. So part of my book is this idea that when you graduate, you should be able to graduate to something. That doesn't mean necessarily gainful employment in every instance, but there are many, many more jobs that people with autism or developmental disabilities can accomplish and be productive members of society, being paid as opposed to having to be funded in terms of the cost. So yes, here in New York, we're looking at a state budget deficit of $16 billion. New York City's budget deficit is between $8 and $9 billion. That will have an impact, and I think that it will come out of the height of things like transition supports and transition training and so forth. But if we start to look at the transition support network as an investment in this population, that many of them will be able to get gainful employment of some capacity, particularly when the virus is over, that it'll be less money spent by society overall than if you just treat the whole thing as like, we just have to keep throwing money at this population until they're not on the planet anymore. And it's just, to me, is a very wasteful, missed opportunity that people who are doing, when they see it in action. I'm the board chair of a not-for-profit in Manhattan called JobPath, which for 40 years has been finding jobs for people with autism and other developmental disabilities. Up until COVID hit, they had 250 people with autism running around with great jobs at museums, whether radio stations, restaurants, office buildings, law firms, even the NBA. So that's we're talking about people making an investment in this group. So we shouldn't hesitate to spend, not be afraid of looking at these big price tags, because they can really pay off in the long run, particularly when you're talking about 50,000 people per year transitioning to adulthood.
Wow.
The question in my mind is not, can we afford it, but really, can we afford not to make that investment?
Right. Or how do we get this at least tackled to some respect? So that actually transitions really nicely into our final couple questions. I'm interested in looking at JobPath. Like where do we go for information about JobPath? And obviously very few of our listeners are actually in New York City where they could benefit directly. But, looking at programs like this might give you ideas about some situations where you could help your own child or your clients. So how do we find out more about Job Path specifically?
Well, you can go onto the Job Path website to find out what their model looks like. It's Job Path NYC online. And basically, they have like a mentoring job coach situation where first they find an employer that has needs. Then they assess the strengths and capabilities of the potential employee. They make a match, and then they stay on the job for a period of time, whether it's weeks or months, to make sure that the individual with autism learns the job, can perform it satisfactorily to the satisfaction of the employer, and that it's evaluated for the employer. So it's not a charity situation. It's evaluated for a real job.
Yeah,
So
which is great. And it's one of probably many organizations in the country and the world that are doing great things. So wherever you're listening, I would encourage you to check out Job Path NYC, and we'll put that in the show notes as well. So people can find your book. It's over 230 pages long. It's a great book. I've only read a little bit of it, but I know that it is filled with great stuff. Your first book, How to Compromise with Your School District Without Compromising Your Child. I can recite that title by heart because it was such a Bible for me. That was published in 2008?
2004, actually.
2004. And that book was and still is really great. And this book just seems like it's definitely next level. And I think the additions of the COVID information are super helpful. So the book is available at difflearn.com, DIFF learn.com. How about people finding you and your work through your law offices? How would they get in touch with you?
You can go onto the my office's website. It should www. Probably don't need that anymore. Mayerslaw.com. MAYERSLAW.com. Mayerslaw.com.
Mayerslaw.com. Awesome. And just to wrap it up, part of my podcast goals are for parents and professionals to be less stressed and lead happier lives. So I know we gave some tips on how to help the kids, but what kind of advice do you have for parents and professionals? Any self-care tips or stress reduction tips that you can think of?
I was going to say, don't put on the television, but I think that might be too flip. So I would just say, there's only so much that parents can do. I think that parents try to take on every single possible thing that they can do, and they can be submerged in the process. I think that if parents, if you take a few things, it's almost like if you have 10 homework assignments, you'll do none of them if you bring it all home. If you bring 3 home, you'll get 3 of them done. So take a step, take another step, take another step, but don't try to do all the steps all at once. It just can be overwhelming, particularly in this environment with COVID. We live in an unprecedented time. I don't think that our community has ever been as stressed out as it is right now. And I agree with you. I hope that this ends soon. But I think parents are remarkably resilient, and they're flexible, and they have tremendous courage. And they obviously love their children very much, because I've seen what parents are doing right now. They're doing the best that they can. And that's all you can really do.
Well, I think that's a great way to end this podcast interview. I really appreciate your time. It's been a real pleasure, both for your first episode, which is episode number 43, as well as for this episode, to get to know you better. You've been, I followed your book since the very beginning, and you've been a great mentor to me, even though I didn't know you at the time, but it's been a real pleasure to get to know you better. And I can see us collaborating in the future with any efforts to improve the lives of children and adults with autism. That's my goal. Fullest potential, be as safe as possible, as independent as possible, and as happy as possible for all of them. And so I know that's your goal too, and really am looking forward to diving in very deeply to your new book, Autism's Declaration of Independence. You can get it at difflearn.com. So have a good day. Thanks for your time.